Okay, so we gotta reset it.
Which one?
Daedalus in Greek mythology invented the labyrinth of Minos to hold the Minotaur. He was imprisoned in a tower with his son Icarus because of his knowledge of that labyrinth. The word daedal describes something that's complex or intricate in design or function. Today I wanted to try to explain to you why some problems are particularly hard to analyze. I started in the dictionary, and the dictionary told me that things that are complex have parts that are intricately combined. It told me that things which are complex are difficult to analyze, understand, or explain. That plebeian definition didn't suffice. I went to a stronger tool. I used an application called WordNet, which gives me access to a database used by lexicographers. This lexical database allows me to look at words and ideas the way a lexicographer would. Lexicographers are the curators of words, and so they're a definitive source for meaning. I was comforted somewhat because I found that as an adjective, complex only had one sense. And so I was onto something that was well defined. I also discovered, and this heartened me, that if something is complex, then it's analyzable and it's decomposable. And at the heart of complexity, that's a requirement. Well, since I want to talk about things hard to analyze, I felt good, but I hadn't done enough. I had nothing that I could explain that we could understand that went beyond chasing these words around in circles. So, like Daedalus and his son Icarus, I want to lift us up, soar above the landscape of ideas, and search for some answers. Analysts look in the dark, dusty corners of science to try to find inspiration so that they can break things down into parts and understand the relationships, so that they can build models to use numbers or symbols or other sorts of things to describe and predict. So, looking across science, I found that complexity rears its ugly head in many places. And I discovered three particular areas that I think help to define the sort of complexity in problems that I was looking for. Because back to my lexical search, I had learned any problem that's worth analyzing is already complex. So complexity was necessary but not sufficient as an explanation. The first area is one that's very familiar to analysts. I like to call it the blessing of dimensionality. Now, in control theory and optimization and other areas, they call it the curse of dimensionality. But of course, I'm a contrarian and they got it wrong. The curse of dimensionality is something that's used to describe problems that explode in size as the problem gets bigger. So you can take a small problem, a toy problem, and you can work through it. You can often understand it just by looking at it. But as the number of elements increase, the complexity increases. You know, this sort of complexity happens in networks, and it happens in a wide variety of problems. Now, I claim it's a blessing, and the reason why is simple. DNA uses just 4 letters in its alphabet, and very simple rules to describe living organisms. Computers use just zeros and ones, and a very simple set of rules in order to provide us intricate and complex sorts of capabilities. A musician will pick up a violin with just a few strings, and if he has the skill, he will make it speak to us and say multitudes of things. There's a blessing there with that complexity and a familiarity. So with problems that fall into this area, even though they're complex, we know that we won't be able to go through and find all the paths to enumerate all the answers and examine them, but we're in familiar territory. But I also discovered a second type of complexity, and this one is a little bit more troubling. In complex dynamic systems, there's a phenomenon called chaos. And in these chaotic sorts of systems, it turns out that it's impossible to predict how the system will change in the long run. Edward Lorenz coined the term butterfly effect to explain this. And his claim is that a butterfly, flapping its wings in China, can weeks later cause a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. It's rather far-fetched, but the presence or absence of that butterfly can have that sort of effect on a system that's on the edge of chaos. But there's still a third variety of complexity that I found that's even more troubling. In social science, and in problems where we're trying to intervene in societies and other sorts of things, it was discovered that there was a type of problem that we call a wicked problem. And wicked problems are what I like to say problems of definition. We don't know how to define the problem to begin with. In a wicked problem, we look at that problem and we don't understand what the relevant elements are, or we don't agree to the relevant elements that define the problem. At its heart, we only understand a wicked problem when we formulated the solution. And that solution only applies to that problem. And we may learn some things we can carry to the next problem, but that problem is unique in its own way. It has a certain sort of complexity that defies definition. So, we soared above the landscape. We looked down at the definition of complexity. We found that complexity is at the heart of these problems that are hard to analyze. But that wasn't sufficient for us to understand why some are incredibly difficult or impossible to solve. So I proposed 3 categories of complexity that allow us to understand the types of complexity that produce those problems. That's our blessing of dimensionality. That's our chaotic systems complexity. And that's our complexity that we find in wicked problems. There is a science of complexity. And the interesting thing about that science of complexity is, while scientific theories are intended to predict, and we test a scientific theory by its predictive accuracy, the science of complexity tells us that there are problems that it's impossible to predict. Einstein famously said, everything should be made as simple as possible, not simpler. I contend this is as simple as complexity gets. Thank you.